I'm Patty Wells and from the Arctic Institute, and it's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Karen Ryan from the Canadian Museum of History. She is the curator of Northern Canada. Her background is in archaeology and anthropology, particularly focused on the first inhabitants of the Arctic, the pre-Inuit and the Inuit, and her fieldwork has taken her to Nunavut, Nunatsiavut, and Nunavik. But her start was at Holy Heart of Mary Regional High School in St. John's for girls. And from those firm beginnings, she went on to become, to study archaeology at Memorial University, then on to McMaster University, and finished her PhD out of the University of Toronto. I actually was familiar with her stuff. I came back to the university and read her honors paper, and most honors papers just disappear into obscurity, but hers was amazing and went on to be published, and it was a real beginning to recognize that Karen was going to be incredible as a researcher. So she's worked at the Canadian Museum of History for almost 10 years and worked on material culture, very meticulous work that has allowed us to understand a lot more about the occupation of the Arctic through the entirety of its history. And this involved also curating a number of exhibits. So tonight you're going to hear about one very major one on the Franklin expedition. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Patty, and thanks everybody for coming here on what is a glorious Thursday before a long weekend. Kudos to you for being in here, not at a patio with a bear or something. Just wanted to correct Patty on one thing. Holy Heart was boys and girls by the time I got there, thank God. The nuns were still afoot, but it wasn't quite as bad as it could have been otherwise. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about the Franklin Expedition exhibition. And word to the wise, if you ever do anything where you have to talk publicly in any way, shape, or form, never use the words expedition and exhibition in the same sentence, because you will invariably, as I will tonight, confuse exhibition for expedition numerous times. So if you think I meant one and when I said the other, go with it, because I probably did mean something. So I'm going to make the first critical error of anybody who works in a museum, and I'm going to assume that most people in the room know something about the Franklin expedition, so I'm not really going to talk a great deal about who John Franklin was, other than to say he was in command of the Royal Navy's largest expedition to look for Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic. The ships, there were two of them, Erebus and Terror, left England in May of 1845. They were last seen by Europeans, which is a critical point for this exhibition, in July of 1845 in the northern part of Baffin Bay, waiting for the ice to clear so they could sail into Lancaster Sound. From a European perspective, that was the last time they were ever seen again, but if you know anything about the Franklin expedition, you know that the Inuit contributions to discovering what happened to the men and what happened to the ships is an incredibly important part of the story, both from the mid-19th century through to today with the discovery of both of the ships, which may or may not be a spoiler for some of you. So there were 129 men that went into the Arctic, and all of them died. And the ships were only recently found after what a lot of people consider to be one of the largest search and rescue or search and discovery missions in the history of the world. So the exhibition is called Death on the Ice, the Mystery of the Franklin Expedition, because even though we know today where both ships are and we have some idea about what happened to the crews, there's still a lot of unanswered questions, and a lot of the work that's being done today is being led by Parks Canada in terms of the underwater archaeology, and the government of Nunavut leading the land-based archaeology. So the main questions I'm going to try to talk about tonight are just these ones right here. How and where do you start when you're planning a large exhibition at a major museum? So the Canadian Museum of History is Canada's National Museum of History. What's our process? It's not the process that's necessarily used at all the different museums, but it's one that we follow at the Museum of History. Who do you involve in terms of people within the museum and people outside of the museum? What do you have room for? That's always the critical thing, because it's kind of like a paper when somebody says you have 5,000 words to write. In this case, we had 6,200 square feet and not an inch more. Even though we desperately tried to get more space. And what can you really reasonably hope to accomplish? Because once the process starts of developing the exhibition, you've got 3 years, still open on time and on budget. Thank God I had nothing to do with the budget and keeping track of everything like that. So don't ask me any questions about the budget because I will just go meh. But I can talk more about what the core team is. So I was the curator for the show, which meant that I was responsible for the content and the research that went into it. We also had a creative developer. Her name is Claire Champ. She's basically the person that makes everything that was in my brain in too much detail make sense to the general public that was coming into the exhibition space. A designer, Carrie McMaster, who took all of our stuff, all of our ideas and all of our words and squished it into the gallery space in a way that made it work. And Danielle Goyer, who was the person in charge of the budget and the scheduling and all the really, really particular things that I discovered I would be absolutely terrible at. So just to start, how and where do you start? So this is just a picture that we took one day in our project room of all of the brainstorming ideas and the beginnings of the exhibition. And it's kind of fun when I look at this picture now because I see the exhibition in it 3 years before it actually opened up. So it's really nice to go back and see that what you were thinking about and what you thought would be good ideas actually worked when you tried to then make it fit into a space. So this was a couple of days, well, more than a couple of days before the exhibition opened. All of the pictures I'll show are of the CMH gallery space, just for ease of my keeping everything straight. It's already been open now at 3 different locations and 1 location coming in the future. So the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, South London, was the first place that the exhibition opened. It's actually something very rare for us to open an exhibition at a space that's not our own because you have less ability to work out the kinks when it's not your space. And there's always a couple of kinks here and there where something doesn't quite go as you had envisioned. So it was at the Canadian Museum of History recently. Right now it's open at Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic of Mystic Pizza in Connecticut. It's actually closing in 10 days, so hop on a plane if you want. And then it's opening at the final venue, which is Anchorage Museum in Alaska. So who do you involve is the next question. So obviously the first group is us. We were the people that came together, decided it was time to do an exhibition on the Franklin expedition, and I didn't mess it up that time. So what had happened was we were brainstorming in the research division one day and coming up with ideas for what future exhibitions we could work on. And I said, well, this museum had never done an exhibition on the Northwest Passage or on the Franklin expedition, which I kind of thought was a bit surprising because it had been in the news at that point for quite a number of years because Parks Canada had resumed looking for the ships. And Franklin never really goes away because it's one of those really unknown questions that we know it ended horribly, so that makes it much more enticing to keep studying, and then the mystery behind it. So we were approved to develop the exhibition at the museum, and then the next step was partners. And so we ended up partnering on the exhibition with the National Maritime Museum Greenwich, the government of Nunavut, Inuit Heritage Trust, and obviously Parks Canada because they were the guys that were looking for the ships. Why is the next question. So again, if you know much about the Franklin expedition, you know that this is the Victory Point note. So this is the only record thus far recovered from the Arctic written by the expedition after they first deserted their ships. So there's 2 messages on it. This is the original message, which said, we overwintered at Beechy Island, we circumnavigated Cornwallis Island, and everything's good. So John Franklin's in command. So you always see this little all well thing here, which is kind of a poignant and ironic sign-off for the expedition. And then 11 months later, you have this message written all around the margins of the paper. And nobody really knows why they wrote those annotations around the margins, why they didn't use a new piece of paper or just flip over the piece of paper. But this message tells a very different story. It says that Sir John Franklin has died. About 20% of the crew at this point have died, including a high proportion of officers, and that they were deserting the ships and heading for the back river. So it's one of these really frustrating pieces of historical information because we don't know why. We don't know why Franklin died. We don't know why so many other people had died at that point and why the officers had died in such a high percentage. And we don't know what they were doing in the back river. So it's been one of these documents found in 1859 that everybody runs with. It has a million interpretations about, none of which are proved correct at this point. But we had it in the exhibition, which was one of these moments when you realize all you can do is ask. Because when I went to the National Maritime Museum to look at their Franklin objects, one of the objects I was very interested in was a Victory Point note, and I thought, oh, maybe they'll give it to us for a couple of weeks, maybe, then they'll take it back. They gave it to us for 2 years. Now, we had to make this really fancy case, which was kind of a nightmare to design. It's a smart glass case, so you push this little button right there, and the glass becomes opaque for, I think, 30 seconds, and you can see down into the actual note. We had to display it this way because the note is in pretty rough condition after a number of years on the tundra, and it was displayed for a long period of time in England, so it's faded. But it was I thought, pretty exciting thing. And 2 years ago, we had at the Canadian Archaeological Association, the museum hosted the conference, and funnily enough, Franklin was just about to open at the CMH, and so one of the things we got to tell people in the audience was the Victory Point note is going to be here, and everybody was very excited, which was kind of rewarding. As the person who's responsible for picking the objects, it's kind of rewarding when people actually like what you've picked. And so there again is a Victory Point note on display. And we really needed to partner with the Maritime Museum because when you think of the Franklin expedition, you think of particular objects that were recovered in the 19th century, and you see them in documentaries and books and all sorts of things. So the shotguns, the keel of a boat, all the little pieces of officer silver, all these really cool things which we were trying to balance when we were developing the show, who was actually going to see the exhibition. There would be a number of people that just came in because they were in the museum anyway and just went into the gallery space. But we knew that there would be a lot of people that knew a lot about the expedition and that wouldn't really be learning anything new from the text and from the information that we were presenting. And for them, it would really be seeing those objects in person. So it was a kind of a balancing act, and that's one of the things that you often have to do with exhibitions is figure out how you can please everybody without pleasing nobody. So based on the visitor feedback comments, we seem to we have made most people happy anyway. And these are just some more examples of the National Maritime Museum objects that we have in the collection. So this is T11 is Terror, so it's one of the traces or the shoulder straps that they would have used, the crew members, when they were pulling sledges or boats. A little cooking stove that was made on board the ship for when they were going out into camps. The other thing, if you know anything about Franklin, is the infamous Goldner tins, which were made, handmade tins, because we didn't have mass machinery at this point. They were painted red, partly you can just see a little bit of this lead solder here. And some of the early work that was done by Owen Beatty on remains of crew members from the expedition showed that some of them had very high levels of lead, and so a lot of people have been debating for a number of years where that lead came from. And a prime suspect has always been Mr. Goldner and his quickly made tins. And the other object is the Guelphic Order of Hanover, which this is a daguerreotype, and I feel bad for Sir John in this picture. If you've ever had a terrible passport photograph or a terrible license that you've had to live with for 5 years until you can cycle out and hope to God that you look better in this next picture, Sir John only had one picture ever taken of him. And if you look through his letters for that period, he had a terrible cold. He looks like he has a terrible cold. I can't help but think that that's a black eye. It certainly looks like he wasn't sleeping, if anything else. And he looks like his uniform, he might not have tried it on before he sat down for this picture. He just looks like a man who's not feeling well. But the interesting thing about this picture is it was probably taken on board the Erebus just before the ships left London, and he's wearing this Guelphic Order of Hanover. And you can see it a little more easily here in this earlier drawing. And the Guelphic Order of Hanover, he took it into the Arctic with him because it was one of his most impressive orders, and it was actually recovered and brought back to England. So it's one of these real, if this object could only speak and tell you the story moments. And so that was also in the exhibition. It was a really opportune time for us to develop the show because unknown to us, the National Maritime Museum had just closed some of its gallery spaces because they were doing a renovation and expansion. And so their Franklin objects actually had just been pulled off of display. So there was a little bit of tugging back and forth about what they wanted for their new galleries and what we could have for the exhibition, because the exhibition is going until almost the end of this year. But we got the Guelphic Order of Hanover. So it's a neat thing because it just, when you think about the fact that nobody knows what happened to Franklin, we know he died on June 11th, 1847, but we don't know where he was buried or anything like that. This particular piece survives and comes back to England. And then Parks Canada, obviously we approached Parks Canada because at this point they hadn't found either ship. but they had been looking for a number of years, and so we wanted to work with them just to really explain to visitors what Parks Canada was doing in terms of their searches. And then, so we had our first meetings with them in the spring of 2014, and surprise, they found the ship 2 months later, which was pretty awesome for us because it got a lot of attention again in the media, and we were excited because that meant we could probably have some artifacts for the exhibition. So this is the installation of part of the wheel. It was found about 300 meters away from the Erebus wreck site. This is Flora Davidson. She's the conservator for Parks Canada. She's the person primarily responsible for getting the artifacts stable. I felt bad for Flora because I'm an archaeologist and I understand how long conservation work can take. But I was also a museum curator for an exhibition that was opening. And so it was a very complicated object to conserve because it's multiple pieces of wood and metal and different things that needed to very carefully dry out. So we knew it wouldn't be ready in time for the National Maritime Museum in London, but we knew it would be ready for us. And then poor Flora kept saying, oh, it's almost ready, it's almost ready, it's almost ready. So we actually took delivery of the wheel and the table leg, which you'll see later, about 2 weeks before the exhibition opened. So it was a pretty nerve-wracking kind of moment for us because it's the first object you see when you go into the exhibition, and we had to have all sorts of contingency plans because we'd have an empty case with a coming soon sort of label, which nobody really wanted. Then we also included the government of Nunavut. This is Doug Stanton. He is leading the land-based search, so on the islands. He was the director of heritage for the government of Nunavut. He's now retired, but he's still very much involved in what's happening. And he's been, amongst other things, excavating some of the human remains, trying to put an identification on them, and including doing DNA work. And of course, this little thing right here is a davit pintle, and this was the piece that was found the day before they found the Erebus. Parks Canada always says we would have looked in that area as part of that schedule, and they would have. But this is Bob Park at the University of Waterloo, Andrew Sterling, the helicopter pilot who actually found the pintle and dug on board the Laurier, the Coast Guard ship. So it was important for us to include them. And also Inuit Heritage Trust, mainly amongst a number of issues because they've been developing a really handy traditional place names list that we wanted to use because we wanted to include in the exhibition Inuit perspective and Inuit knowledge, and the fact that Inuit would never do things the way that Europeans tend to do in terms of naming things after people. And the other thing we wanted to really make sure that we would do is have space to actually talk about the 129 people that died, because a lot of the coverage about Franklin and a lot of the pundits that talk about Franklin talked about them as fools and twits and ill-prepared and that sort of thing. We wanted to make them human. We wanted to make sure that people understood that they were actually real people with dreams and hopes and ambitions. And when they went into the Arctic, they left their friends and their families behind. So you have John Franklin, Francis Crozier, who was the head or the captain of Terror, and he became the overall head of the expedition when Franklin died. James Reed, who was actually not in the Royal Navy, he was a whaler who'd operated in Baffin Bay for about 20 years. He was hired as the ice master, so he was going up into the crow's nest and reading the ice and trying to predict where the expedition should go. And James Fairholm, who is the third lieutenant on board the Erebus. And it was important for us to really give them names and give them faces and stories, because it seems sometimes like the Franklin expedition sailed 5 million years ago and nobody really has any attachment with them. But this was about 2 hours before the exhibition opened to the public. And so we have Rick Burrows. He came to Ottawa from Australia, specifically for the opening. He'd also gone to Greenwich for the opening there. I'm going to get my greats mixed up. He's the great-great-grandson of James Reed, the ice master. We have Brian Spenceley, who actually was on Beechey Island with Owen Beatty and helped exhume his great-great-grand-uncle, John Hartnell. Thomas Hartnell, his brother, also died on the expedition, so it was really nice to have them come in and see how we had portrayed the expedition. And Jamie Fairholm and his son, and he is the great-great-great-grandnephew of James Fairholm. So it was this whole idea of being respectful and making it real and reminding people that, hey, these guys, they're real. They're just not numbers on a page. And by the time the exhibition closed at CMH, we had relatives of Franklin come from New Zealand, other people come from England. It was really nice to meet them because we knew that they were real, but we wanted to make sure that the people that were coming into the exhibition knew that as well. And the other thing that we did was include lots of quotes. So when the Franklin ships sailed across the North Atlantic, they stopped at the Whalefish Islands in Disco Bay on the west coast of Greenland. And that was to offload the supplies that a third vessel had taken with them that they didn't want to carry along with them. So when that ship left and went back to England, it took 5 people that were deemed to be medically unfit to sail into the Arctic. And it also took the journals. And so this is James Fitzjames. He was the commander and captain of the Erebus. So he was third in command overall of the expedition. And this is Stephen Stanley, the surgeon on board the Erebus. And you really get a sense of what those people's personalities and ideas were like when you're reading their letters home. And so we didn't actually use this quote in the exhibition. I really tried, but it wouldn't have made sense. One thing I didn't mention is I have no pity anymore for people that complain about 75-word abstracts and how they needed to have 100 words or something like that. Our text strategy was 100 words for introductions to zones, 50 words for a more general statement on something, and then 20 words. So yeah, no pity anymore. And you can only get so far by hyphenating words, because then they figure out that suddenly your text is really long, and so it gets cut anyway. But I love this quote because it's just the giving one unpleasant ideas that he would not mind cutting one's leg off immediately, if not sooner. So you can it's just a sense of humor of these people and the camaraderie that they were having. And the other thing we obviously needed to do was talk about the Inuit contributions in the 19th century and the Inuit contributions right up to today. So that was by talking about people like Tukalituk and Ipervik, who were the translators and guides with Charles Francis Hall, who's there in the middle. These are probably the 2 most important people in terms of accumulating knowledge about the Franklin expedition in the 19th century. Charles Francis Hall gets all the credit, but he didn't speak Inuktitut, and his translators did, and so all the information that he got from his guides is basically what we know from that period. And then the modern Inuit contributions, so obviously Louis Kamakak, who's on the Canadian Geographic magazine, was the preeminent Inuit historian until he died a couple of years ago. But in terms of how does it come together, this was the gallery space that the exhibition was in. These things, horrible things, are pillars. And pillars are always in the wrong place when you want to put something anywhere. It's kind of like when you're building an IKEA shelf and it doesn't quite fit against the wall, except it's on a much bigger scale. So we took this space, it's about 6,200 square feet, and we filled it as much as we could. And sometimes when you go to an exhibition, you probably don't realize because you can't see the design. A lot of the spaces are kind of empty and blank, and they're behind a wall that you don't notice as a visitor. There are no empty blank spaces on this floor plan. It is chock-a-block full. It was described in somewhat charitable terms as a heavy exhibition. It was 197 pages of text, when we did our numbering, so you can see it starts here with the introduction, then you go through into these areas. We were careful with our numbering because there's actually 10 zones, but if we told management there was 10 zones, they wouldn't have let us have 10 zones. So we have 3.1, 3.2, 4.1, 4.2, that sort of thing. And one of the things we wanted to do with the Inuit oral histories is not just have me or somebody else talking about what Inuit traditional knowledge is, because what's the point of that? So we had 4 listening stations where we had Louis Kamakak, Inuki Adami, and Mark Tutiak speaking about oral histories and Franklin. So the very first listening station is right here, just when you come in through the exhibition space, and hopefully this will work. This is what we were fumbling with earlier. I just wanted to play this listening station. It's about It's Louis Kamakak talking about what oral history is.
It was very accurate and important because it was the only way of passing down the knowledge. You had no writing system, so it would mean that everything was passed down to oral history. And for directions, Inuit, when they travel, an elder might say, I want to go visit their relatives in this other region, and he would have to give the person all the directions to all the landmarks that he would come across. And all the landmarks have place names, and place name was very important for people to pass down the knowledge, but also because place name tells a history of the landmark or the land. It was good for fishing, it was good for hunting. Inuit would never name a place after a person. It was always a good hunting area. It was because of the landscape these place names were passed on through generations, and oral history is still very important. We have less people telling stories, because going back to my time when I was growing up, my first 7 years we lived in England, and in the summer we did. So there was no television, there was no other entertainment but to hear your great-grandmother or your grandmother or your grandparents tell a story. It was like a story that they tell every night. It's part of entertainment, and also everything was passed on to the next generation for teaching and also for passing down the history.
So the point that he makes about how Inuit would never name something after a person or anything like that, you can see this here. So we have Washington Bay. Inuit oral accounts talk about seeing a group of very sick and starving Europeans in this area after they had abandoned maybe Terror, because Terror we now know is found right here. But it's not called Washington Bay. It's called an area where there's good resources. You know, it's a descriptive thing, and we wanted to make sure that that came across, that visitors again understood that Inuit weren't sitting around the Arctic waiting for ships to go by that were being directed by Europeans. It's something much more than that. Obviously, the Franklin expedition is one part of that oral history knowledge, but it's not the only part, and it's not the reason for Inuit oral history to exist. One thing I did get to do, because as Patty mentioned earlier, I'm from Newfoundland, and I really like dogs. I have 3 of them right now. Don't ask me why. It made sense at the time. So the Erebus had a dog, a Newfoundland dog. And so one of the letters that was sent back to England by James Fairholme, who was on the Erebus, talked about old Nep, so Neptune the Newfoundland dog, and how he became less and less unwieldy on board the ship and was really fitting in through the course of their sailing across the Atlantic. James was obviously a dog person. His brother William was obviously a dog person, because we didn't put the full quote on the exhibition panel. We didn't have time, but it ends with, and as a general favorite, I often give him an extra kiss. It continues, for William, who's his brother. So it had to go in. It's curatorial prerogative for that one. So what can you really reasonably open on time and on budget, and what decisions are you making? So this is just another view of what the exhibition floor plan eventually looked like, starting here, going through into the exit area. And what do you have room for? So what we ended up doing was making a decision really early on about something that was really cool. And so that's this thing right here. So this is not a full-size replica or a floor plan of the ships. We didn't have 129 feet, and they wouldn't let us knock out a wall. So we decided that we could do a scale representation of part of it. So we did a scale representation of the stern area and of the bow. And a lot of our design work now is being done with computers, but we also have maquettes, and maquettes are actually really useful because you can see what things are supposed to look like. So this is a representation of the great cabin where Sir John would have made a lot of decisions and where the officers would have met. And on the floor is just the spaces that each of the officers on the crew would have had. So the idea with this space, and that's just to give you an idea, we could fit just under a third of the back end of the ship onto the floor. And here's another view. So there's the table. This table's to scale, so we took the plans where everything is marked out. We knew how big the table in Franklin's cabin was going to be. So we had this animation going down that showed different activities that might have been occurring in the cabin at certain times. And conveniently enough, Parks Canada recovered the leg, or a furniture leg, from the Erebus just outside of the debris field below the stern. And there's the leg, and so we got to put the leg into our scale representation of the table, which was really fun because we would sometimes go in the exhibition space and see people discovering it, because we didn't have big flashing arrows that said, there's the table like from the Erebus, but people would be wandering around just reading what's on the wall, and then they'd go, holy crap, what's that right there? And that's the table like that John Franklin banged his knee on. So it's kind of fun when you're in this space realizing that it's the great cabin, it's one of the largest areas on the ship, and it's actually really small. If you think about all of the officers coming in there together, it can get pretty crowded because these are lockers. These would have been raised. So really, the only space would have been just walking around here, and you'd access the room through a door. So you'd sometimes see Franklin, the expedition is not really a child-friendly expedition. Parts of it are certainly things that you might want to think twice about telling your kids about when they're really young. But what we would come into the exhibition space and see were people walking through with their kids, just saying, okay, this is how much space you have. Just imagine you're carrying things along, and it gives a sense of just how small the ships are. There's an image I'm realizing I should have put in here of the opening night when we had, this is just the animation again on the table, when we had the Parks Canada divers come in for the opening, and they were actually walking around on the space on the floor, looking at the floor plans, because of course they've seen the ship, they've dived on the Erebus, but the issue for them is that there's a lot of debris, and also that some of the dividers between the officers' cabins are down right now. So they actually were standing there like, this is it, like this is really cool. And it was actually reaffirming for us because we had worked with Marc-Andre Bernier, who's the manager for the underwater team at Parks, but the other guys hadn't really seen it, and certainly hadn't seen it on the floor before. And for them to be like, yeah, you could almost see them visualizing swimming over it. It was a reaffirming thing. And John Moore, who's one of the divers, he's the guy that found the bell, actually lay down on the bunk. And I have a picture, which I should have put in here because I promised him I would never use it, and I would never use it because that would be terrible. But it's cool because it gives you the sense, it helped bring the ship alive and helped bring the people alive for people that were coming into the exhibition. And then we did a scale of the bow. So this is again the maquette. This pillar right here is actually in the right spot for the foremast. It was very exciting. It's the only time I think in the history of the museum, which opened in 1989, that a pillar did not get in the way of something. So you could, we had, I think, and I don't know if we ever put a sign up that told people that this, but you could stand, you could walk up through this space, come up to the bow of the ship, and we have, I'll show an image later, a video at the bow of the ship of an ice field. So you could stand at the top of this ship, listen to an oral history about the ice conditions and the weather on that part of the northwest coast of King William Island where the ships were first beset in ice, and watch this scenery, this video play before you. I don't have a copy of the video because it's about 500 megabytes. It would kill every computer. But it was really fun because it was a computer animation, because we couldn't find an ice field that didn't have mountains and cities and everything else behind it. We gave the computer guy the lat and longitude for the ships when they were first beset in ice, and he could figure out what the sun was doing from there. So we actually have the sun going across the horizon in a 24-hour pattern that gives you a sense of, again, what those men would have been looking at. And most importantly, there's Neptune, keeping an eye on the food. So we had a little animation that showed lots of barrels and crates of food that were labeled with salt pork and flour and that sort of thing. And they'd move around and slowly disappear, just as an idea of, as you're in the Arctic longer and longer, you're starting to run out of food. So there's just an animation again of that video. And for the people that were the real Franklin people that really knew the story and just oftentimes want to see the stuff that they've seen on documentaries, you could stand right here and you could see the stuff, but you couldn't get to it. So it was kind of the same sort of feeling maybe that the Franklin expedition members had standing on the bow of that ship waiting for the ice to break, and it didn't. So again, here's our reconstruction of the ship. It's about a third of the entire exhibition space. We had a big area for the Franklin search where you'd see a lot of those really iconic artifacts that are associated with the expedition. Those were decisions we made early on. We said, these are really cool. This is really great for visitor engagement. It's going to tell you a lot of information without you realizing it, because it's kind of a fun experience. So teenagers actually sat down and read stuff and did things, and sat at this little seaman's table right here and learned how much food the crews would have had on a daily basis. So that meant that if we used up a lot of space for these two zones, we had not that much space for everything else. And so one of the places that got cut initially is the setting sail kind of preparation history of the search for the Northwest Passage. And we based this design on this 1843 drawing of the Admiralty boardroom. And so the Admiralty in Whitehall was in charge at that time of the Royal Navy and the planning of expeditions like Franklin's. So we took this this picture with its maps, with its ship models, with its big table in the middle, and and we tried to put that into this exhibition space. And then we were still stuck with the idea of how do you set up 350 years of searching for the Northwest Passage in a really small amount of space, because if you have walls and walls and walls of text, nobody's going to sit there and read it. It's boring, it's stupid, it doesn't look very appealing. So what we ended up doing was this. And this is an animated map, obviously, and it shows the history of the Northwest Passage expeditions that went into the Arctic looking for a route from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this was the other really effective piece of AV that we have in the show. We actually had people, okay, hopefully it'll, oh well. It gives a sense of the exploration and the length of time that Europeans were looking for the Northwest Passage, because again, around the time that Parks Canada was really looking for the ships and not finding them, there was a lot of criticism of the Canadian government's interest in finding the ships and in the money that was being used to try to find them. And people were kind of thinking of the 1845 Franklin expedition as the first expedition into the Arctic, and we really wanted people to understand, no, actually, the searches for the Northwest Passage by Europeans began with Frobisher in 1576. So it's a long history, it's a lot of different people looking and gradually filling in that map and putting information down and recording what they see about animals and the people that they met and the weather conditions and all sorts of things. So by the time Franklin sailed in 1845, there wasn't really very much left from the perspective of spaces on a map for them to chart. So when they left London, they were very hopeful. They thought they might even get through in a single season. James Fitzjames writes in a letter home that he hoped they would have one winter in the ice because he wanted to do magnetic observations. And probably after a certain point in time, he really kicked himself for that. But what you're getting, again, is just this sense of Europeans going along and really setting the stage for what they thought would be an optimistic success. So when Franklin sails into the Arctic in 1845, and then you don't hear from him in 46 and 47 and 48, the idea that it would be a complete and utter catastrophe was an incredible shock. This is the British Empire at the height of its power, and you have an expedition, which was a space shuttle of its day, going in and failing utterly. You have no survivors, you have no conclusion of the passage. The UK doesn't actually sail through the Northwest Passage. It's Roald Amundsen later on. But it gives you a sense of just how little was left. So you have, by the end, if this map wasn't so terrible at this point, you would have Cape Walker up here, and you would have Cape Herschel down there. Those were the 2 points that were known by Europeans. All Franklin and his ships had to do was sail this little 900-mile section, which, if you know anything about ice in the Arctic, is some of the worst ice in the Arctic. So they went into the Arctic in a period when there was bad ice, and they went into a part of the Arctic where that ice really accumulates and doesn't break up. Even today, Parks Canada was having trouble getting up in that area a couple of times. And the other thing we needed to really grapple with the exhibition was how to handle sensitive topics. And so that means cannibalism. Cannibalism was incredibly controversial when it was first revealed as having occurred with the expedition, when John Rae met Inuit who talked about seeing sick and starving men, seeing skeletons that had obviously been butchered, and seeing containers that had human meat inside. So when he brought this information back to London, and the Admiralty really did poor John Rae wrong, we needed to be able to both talk about the cannibalism in the exhibition and also talk about the reception of it in London. So what we did was we had a warning at the beginning of the exhibition that said, we will talk about cannibalism, we will show dead bodies, pictures of dead bodies, but you don't actually have to go in those rooms. So if you have small children or if you don't want to actually see that sort of thing, you can bypass it without getting traumatized. Of course, every time you were in the exhibition, all the kids were making a beeline for there. And I was like, hey, we had warnings. And so the other thing we did was have 2 quotes, one by John Rae, where he talks about the Inuit accounts of cannibalism, and the other is Charles Dickens. And poor John Rae got into a war of words with Charles Dickens, which nobody should ever have attempted. And the quote that we actually ended up using, it took us about 6 weeks to finesse this down because it's not what he actually wrote. So he wrote, or we have in the exhibition, no man can, with any show of reason, undertake to affirm that this sad remnant of Franklin's gallant band were not set upon and slain by Inuit themselves. So I won't give you the actual words that Dickens used because they're quite offensive. I'll just say that he didn't use the word Inuit. But we wanted to acknowledge the fact that that debate happened and that Dickens was perhaps not at the forefront of historical viewpoints as we would have them today. So we called it the discrete area, where we talked about cannibalism. We had a table because nobody's really sure what might have killed the 129 men. And we didn't want to tell people our favorite theories because that's not part of what we wanted to do with the exhibition. So we had 6 or 7 different potential causes: lead poisoning, tuberculosis, starvation, just mundane everyday health concerns, botulism, and we gave pros and cons. And so if you had an older child or if you were undecided yourself, you could go in and you could look and read all of the evidence that supported lead poisoning and all of the evidence which called it into question. And some of the reviews actually of the exhibition, I hadn't anticipated it being reviewed in this way, but it makes perfect sense. If you had older kids, it was a great way to teach them about critical thinking. So you could read something that said, of course it's lead poisoning. You know, the men on Beachy Island had really extreme levels of lead poisoning. And then you could read the, but wait, not so fast part of it as well, which is that in London in this period, all of the different water systems were made with lead pipes. So they would have had a lot more lead in their system to begin with than we did. So they may not have been that elevated in terms of their lead levels. And so this is a feature on Doug Stanton's work on the human remains from King William Island and the area. So here he is excavating one of the skulls, this one. And what they did was they sent it to a forensic artist who modeled clay on them to get an idea of what their features look like, and also had drawings of what they might look like on the hope that maybe you might recognize one of the officers from their daguerreotypes. And he's also been doing DNA work. So what he's trying to do is identify how many people are actually represented in those bone fragments that are coming out of King William Island in the area, and maybe then also even get an idea on who the person is. So right now they don't have any firm IDs on any of the physical remains, but he's got lots and lots of the direct descendants of the expedition donating their DNA so that hopefully one of these days they'll get a match. This is an aside. If you ever do media, always be conscious of where you're standing. This was in the Ottawa Citizen. Yeah, I got lots of emails about that. And then as we were planning the exhibition, surprise, Parks Canada found the Erebus. So this is, I think this is John Moore's flashlight pointing at the bell. You probably saw this. This is John here, Ryan Harris, and you may also recognize this person right here, Stephen Harper. So it was a big moment for us. We thought it was super cool that they found the ships, or one of the ships. And so we had about a half a day of like, wow, that's really amazing. Who would have thought it? And then we went, oh God, how is this going to impact our planning? Because we were well into the exhibition design process at that point. And what artifacts could we show? What artifacts would be ready in conservation? It was really exciting, but really kind of also like, oh, wow, they found a ship, great. So again, just a reminder of the exhibition space when you go in through. And what we ended up doing was Parks Canada, we had decided very early in the process, would be responsible for the research and the content in their zone because they knew in the most detail what their divers were doing and what the state of the research was. So there's the bell. They did this really fantastic model of what the Erebus looks like today. There was an AV station where people could touch different points on the ship and see what artifacts had been recovered from there. We worked with them and we did a 1 by 1 meter square of Erebus where some of the plates had been found. So these plates and also the prism, they had been found together in this area just to give visitors a sense of just how much stuff is still on those ships. Like we had, at this point, 65 artifacts pulled off of Erebus, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands left. We also made the decision with Parks Canada to have lots of videos so they could be updated as the exhibition was developing. So if you've ever seen the video of them about 5 minutes after they found the Erebus, Ryan Harris is sitting there on this small craft. He looks like he hasn't had a shower in about 2 weeks. And they're recounting finding the ships, and that's it. And so you get that in the exhibition space. This is Meryl Oliver and Joanne Ranger. They were the two people primarily responsible for this content. So it was a fun collaboration to work with them on. Our designer, Carrie, had this is an idea of the sea ice with a little triangular hole, which was the triangular hole they cut above the Erebus when they did their winter dive on the ice. Just a fun fact of how the artifacts get in the case. Well, this is the case for the bell. Doesn't have a bell on it yet. Well, that's because it takes lots and lots of people to install some of the artifacts when they're complicated. And what you can't see with this base is, it looks tippy. You'd think, wow, somebody could come up there and shove that that over. And the museum has had people that have tried to do that, not with this case, but with others. So our museum has a fake floor. So underneath this floor, there's about a 6-inch space where we want to run our electrical and anything else, AV cables that we need. It's also a great way to anchor your case to your concrete floor. So if people were interested in trying to ring the bell, which they couldn't because the knocker's been rusted out, they wouldn't be able to. So here's Flora doing something conservation-y with the bell, a whole bunch of other people standing around. This is actually Carrie McMaster, the designer. And lots of standing around and fussing and picking and really hoping that things work together really well. That's Carrie because she was the designer and it was her design that was going to have to be proofed as the exhibition was installed. So she's really happy that the bell is in, it's happy, everybody else is happy about it. And then we put the case on and ta-da. So this is actually behind here, the entrance to the exhibition space. You had to turn and go through the other area. The wheel fragment was right here, but you could see the bell through this little semi-transparent screen. So it gave you an idea of what was to come, but we made you wait and work for it. You had to read stuff before you could get there. And then surprise, they found the terror. Wow, they found the terror in 2016. We were opening in the National Maritime Museum in July 2017. That was really exciting and really terrifying. But fortunately, well, not fortunately, of course, Parks Canada has been focusing on the Erebus because the Erebus is in much shallower water. It's much more fragile at this point. So no artifacts have been recovered off of the terror, so we could get away with acknowledging the terror's discovery, but only having a video and a couple of other pictures. So in terms of what's next, the exhibition is still on right now at Mystic Seaport Museum. It's closing in 10 days, and then it's going to Alaska. And after that, that's the 4th and final venue. The artifacts are then getting dispersed, which means they're going back to their home institutions, whether that be in London or the museum in Gatineau or somewhere else. But the last thing that I'm working on right now, is an exhibition called The Ones We Met, Inuit Traditional Knowledge in the Franklin Expedition. So this is a 500 square foot 2D show that we've developed for Nunavut. So we've worked with Inuit Heritage Trust, and the government of Nunavut's been helping us with the translations. And this show is supposed to be ready later in May. It's going to travel to all communities of Nunavut over the next 5 years. It's in 4 languages, which the museum has never done before. It's vaguely terrifying because I only speak one of them well. And if we print this and there's problems, that will not be ideal, because in working with Inuit Heritage Trust, they really wanted something that would help promote oral history and traditional knowledge in Nunavut. So we're using the Franklin expedition almost as a case study to talk about the importance of oral history and why it matters today. So it's also going to have a southern copy, so you may see it at strange places that you weren't expecting to see this. And that's pretty much it for the behind the scenes of exhibition planning. Remember, never call an exhibition anything with the word expedition in it. So thank you.